Welcome back to Auto Technic. We're back out working on our 355 project. Now everything might be covered up and it looks like it's been put to bed, but don't be fooled. We still have plenty of work ahead of us. A lot of things to get taken care of today, so let me drop you guys in and show you exactly what we're going to be working on. All right, guys, before we jump into all the work, let's give you a quick refresher on where we currently stand on this 355. Now, the car is under the cover, we got the engine all covered up, and well, frankly, that's because we're still waiting on our heads to get back from the machine shop. So if you recall, during our pre-service inspections, I found some discrepancies on my compression between bank 1 and bank 2. Initially, I thought it was going to be inaccurate or incorrect cam timing in between bank 1 and bank 2. However, when I did my pre-service checks before teardown, I found that the cam timing was spot on in between bank 1 and bank 2. So we didn't have a good answer of why we had a 30 psi difference in between our highest and lowest cylinder on compression, which after talking to the customer and advising them on different options, I decided it would just make sense to do a leak down test. Since I had the degree wheel on, it was going to take me just a matter of minutes. Ran that leak down test and found high leak down primarily on bank 1, which was our side with low compression. So what that's telling us, when we have that high leak down, all of our air is coming out predominantly of the exhaust valves. However, on bank 2, it was coming out of the cylinder 5 intake valve pretty severely. So that's telling us that our valve job went, which usually on 355 is an indication that the valve guides have gone. So I advised the customer of that. He approved the repairs, so we've moved forward. The cylinder heads are off the engine, and I actually have those sent out to my machine shop, which is actually out of state. And my turnaround time on that right now, I'm told, is probably 3 to 4 weeks. So we have a bit of time to get everything else prepped and ready to go. And really the sad truth of this is I think I'm going to be at a stopping point waiting for those heads to get back, which is less than ideal because given my small amount of space that I have, I don't really want to have a car in here just waiting for repairs. So my plan for today is going to be working through all the small little things that I found on the car during our pre-service inspections and all the additional repairs that the clients approved. So it's really a lot of smaller miscellaneous jobs that we get taken care of. Really the bias of time that we need, so when our heads come back, we're ready to rock and roll and get this thing back together, back on the road, back into the client's hands. All right. I think the best place to get started will be on the car over here. We'll get the car cover off, get everything addressed that we need to onto the car, and that's going to allow me to get the cover back on, get the car, keep it protected, nice and clean, and then we'll focus all of our attention to the engine and drivetrain, which is really going to need the bulk of the work for today's video. So we'll get this off, and I will bring you guys in and show you what we're going to be handling over here on the car. Alright, so here are just some of the things I need to take care of on the car back here. If you look right up under here, there is a missing rivet for our rear challenge grille trim piece. It is present on the other side, so I have some rivets. I need to get that rivet replaced. I did notice on my inspection that I have a license plate light bulb that's out, so I need to pop those bulbs out down there, see if it's a bad bulb. Unfortunately, I can't really get any power to the car because I have the drivetrain out, so we'll just investigate the bulb, get that replaced with a new one, even just because we have it out. Get that taken care of. But really the satisfying part of today's project, which again, like I said, these are all pretty minor things, is our bonnet struts. You can see that they're gone and all the gas is leaked out and they no longer hold the bonnet up. Pretty minor repair, and fortunately the client has given me the okay to get them replaced on the front and the rear bonnet. Even though the rear bonnet is off, you can see that we just have the struts, so I'll get those swapped out. And while I'm up here, I'm going to just take a minute and grab my vacuum and clean up all of that white mess. So all of that comes off when you pop this seal off, and normally I'd come back and clean it up at the tail end of service, but like I said, I'm trying to maximize my time I have now. So we'll get all that vacuumed, get all that cleaned up, get our struts put in. And the only other thing I really need to do up here to the car is our hardware right here. For some reason, this car is missing all the mounting hardware that holds the rotor to the hubs. Found it quite strange. Never really seen that before because from what I can tell, these are the factory rotors. So I don't know why someone would have removed it and not put it back on. Yeah, we have our lug bolts that will go in and index the rotor to the hub so it doesn't move, but we want everything factory, so we got our factory hardware to go in. Pretty simple, put that in. I'm still waiting on the other one. It's on back order. So there's two pieces that bolt into the hub and hold that on, and it's actually missing on the front and the rear However, we're going to leave the rears off for now because we have other repairs where it actually may benefit us to have those off. So, is what I'll do is I'm going to set you guys down. I'm going to jump on the car, get all these things taken care of. Like I said, they're all small little, not super exciting repairs. Get everything sorted on the car. We'll get the cover back on it. Once we're finished with that, we're going to jump over to our drivetrain. But for now, let's get these items knocked out on the car. Okay, the work on the car, no surprises there, super straightforward. Found a matching rivet, got that taken care of. Got all of our struts in, so we got the car covered back up, and well, it's just gonna be ready for when the engine's ready to go back into it. When I had the vacuum out, I did take advantage and get all of the rock and gravel and just dirt and grime that gets stuck up on top of the transmission and in all these little pockets. I got all of that vacuumed out. Now, the 355 is one of the first Ferraris that has specific undertrays on it, which is meant to create a low pressure area under the car, and that's to increase downforce and aerodynamics. The big downside to those low pressure areas is it sucks all the rock and gravel up onto the drivetrain of the car and makes a huge mess. 355 is not too bad because the undertrays aren't very large on the back of the car and their effect isn't that dramatic, but say like a 430, 458 and later, those cars have very big substantial undertrays, and anytime you drop that under tray, even after minimal mileage on the car, it seems like that car was down a gravel road. It dropped so much dirt, sand, gravel, rocks. So it's really a bit of a nuisance, but it is just kind of the side effect of that low pressure area and how everything works. So when I have access to everything, I'll take the time and get it all cleaned up. And it's just a lot easier now. It makes things a little bit better, especially when you have an open engine. We don't want anything getting inside the engine, so we want to be sure to get everything cleaned up. But now that we're here on the drivetrain, I think we're going to shift our attention and take care of these 3 cover plate gaskets on the gearbox. Now, this would have been a lot easier to do with the engine in the car, where I could show you guys easily what we're doing. But we got the engine on the car here, and there's only maybe 10 inches of space. I'm going to do my best to get a camera down in there so you guys can follow along as I get these cover plates removed, the new gaskets put in, and everything sealed back up. So, let's see how it goes. All right. So, to get started, we have the 3 cover plates here. We're going to take the speed sensor out first, which has 2 brackets that are held on with these bolts for the cover plates, and 1 bolt for the sensor itself. And we'll just get this out of the way, and the rest of the cover plates should zip right off. Go. And just like everything else on the engine, these have our nuts and a separate washer on them I had one I see flew off already. Yeah, right there. So we have to come back and get our washers off. There you go. And that should allow us to get these cover plates, or these retaining clips, out of the way. Speed sensor out of the way. It's smooth sailing to get the rest of this hardware off and get our cover plates off. So, I am fortunate and I have a heat pump in the shop. However, it is not the greatest and it really struggles when it's cold outside. And today it's about 30 degrees. And I can tell you that that heat pump is going in and out of a default lockup mode. So what I'm trying to say is it's not really warm in here today. And laying on the ground is certainly not making that any better on this cold concrete. But it is what it is. At least I have a heat pump to start with. Now, when I first got this place, it actually had a wood stove in here, which I initially was real excited about because I really enjoy the heat from a wood stove. But I actually moved away from it because it was way too messy. Is what I found is that wood stove is actually pumping a lot of ash and just crumb throughout the entire shop, not to mention how long it took to actually get going and time spent stoking it and maintaining the fire. So I still love wood stoves, but it wasn't the best solution for heating the shop. Get over our washers here. Oh, we missed 2 bolts. Shame on me. All right, that's all of them. So I'm going to take a quick inventory of my hardware, sure I got everything, and we'll pop those cover plates off. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. Our 2 brackets. Set this up on the bench. And we'll see if I can't drop this cover plate in my bucket of oil. Oof. Ooh. There we go. That was close. I guess we'll go for the center cover plate now. And made a pretty good mess on that one. Making quite the mess. Let's see if we can just finish the job off. Ah, not what I wanted. Oh well. Yeah, well. I guess we'll just let this drip. And I'll fish out that other cover plate. And we need to start getting those cover plates cleaned up while we let this just drip out. So a little bit of time and elbow grease in the solvent tank, and we got these things looking good as new. Got all the grummy, dirty gear oil off the bottom on the inside, all the dirt and grime off the outside, and these were also sealed on with some sealant around the perimeter. So I cleaned all that sealant off, scuffed the surface, and I got it out of all the holes as well. I'm real particular on that stuff. I don't like leaving any traces of that old sealant on there. I clean everything off so we're ready fresh. Now when I install these gaskets, I do use a small layer of sealant on both sides when it goes back together, so there will be sealant on it again. Just one of my little weird ticks of OCD, I just have to have all the old stuff off. So you can see that we're all clean and good as new. Went through and cleaned all the nuts and washers as well, so everything is as clean as I can get it and it's ready to go back on. Now I do need to get underneath on the transmission itself and clean off the areas where those cover plates will bolt up onto the transmission. I need to get that sealant that's on there off, scuff the surfaces, and get all the gear oil off, which, speaking of gear oil, we have that dripping in our drain pan. Now, I kind of alluded to this earlier. I think I'm going to hold off on installing these cover plates now, and we're just going to wait. The reason being is because that sealant that I said that I put on with these cover plates, I don't want to put that sealant on and potentially have gear oil get in on it while that sealant is still wet, compromising my seal. Since we're not in a hurry and time is in my favor on getting this back together and in the car, I can afford to have this sit for a day or two, maybe a week, let everything drip and drain out, and then come back at a later time, clean and prep the bottom of the transmission when hopefully all that gear oil majority of it has drained out, and then we can put the cover plates on and get everything sealed up. So really, I don't think it's that critical that I do that now, but because I have the benefit of the time, there's no reason not to. So what we're going to do in the meantime is we're going to jump over and take care of all of our CV boots on our rear axles. Now, our left inner boot is torn completely open, and you can see where we're throwing CV joint grease on the transmission. And our right boot is cracking pretty heavily, not quite torn open yet, but we are going to replace both inners and outer boots. So we need to get the axles removed from this drivetrain. All right, so I'm just going to get started over here on the right side, and I do take off the wheel speed sensor because we're going to be dropping the hub and knuckle forward. And although there's enough slack in here to not do anything with it, I prefer not to, because as these cars age, they tend to kind of get brittle with anything that's rubber or plastic, and I don't want to put any stress on that I don't need to do, because the last thing I want is have this car back together, give it to the client, and then down the road he has an ABS light because I maybe pulled a wire or damaged something. So we're going to take the couple extra seconds and take these 2 screws out, which are going to enable us to slide everything out so we don't have to worry about any damage. So you can see that it was 2 quick screws, the sensor's out of the way, there's no reason not to. And we won't have to worry about inflicting any consequential damage to that. So now that that's out of the way, we're going to work on getting the brake caliper off. Again, there's just simply not enough room to move everything back there while keeping the caliper on the knuckle and hub on top of it. Same thing with the wiring. I don't want to put a lot of stress on this brake line, so it'll come off. Now this upper bolt has a bracket for that wire harness that we just took off for the wheel speed sensor, and we'll just be sure that we note where that was at so we can get everything back to how it was. Bolts are coming out nice. I like it when they don't fight you. It's always a little bit of a treat. Now before we pop this caliper off, I'm gonna grab myself a zip tie. Because I do not want to hang this caliper on the brake line. So we'll slide it off and find somewhere suitable. Set it there for a second to get the zip tie positioned. So our caliper is out of the way and supported, and we can probably get this rotor off since it's missing the hardware like the front ones were. Hence, this is why we didn't put it on. And take a look at our parking brake shoes. Look pretty good. Now, normally you don't have to take the rotor off to do this. I'm only doing it because it's missing the hardware and I don't want it falling off when I'm doing the repairs. But if that hardware was on, I would leave the rotor on for that stage. Now, we're going to take everything off up here on the upper control arm and the shock to the knuckle. But before I undo the shock bolt, you can see that it has this bracket right here for the sway bar, and it has one small, it's like a 6mm by 1.0 bolt that holds it in right there. We're going to take that out. The reason being is once I take this bolt out, that's going to be the only thing holding this sway bar and this bracket to the knuckle, and we're going to be fighting it. It's going to be in the way, and it's better to have it completely free, especially since I won't have the sway bar trying to kind of counteract the other side of the suspension when I'm working on it. So it's just one of those things. It's quick and easy. Take that bolt out. So now it's time to get the axle nut off. This is a 36mm. It's staked on two sides. I've tried to drive the stakes out, but a lot of times they fold over on themselves and you can't drive them out cleanly. So this nut's definitely a one-time use. We do have new ones, but when I pull this off, it's going to tear what's left of those stakes that they put in and effectively ruin this nut. I have never had one do any damage to the threads of the axle. Luckily, the nut is softer and it just gives. So here we go. So, and it tore right there. So you can see the two pieces that sheared off. Because like I said, tried to punch them out, but it didn't work. So that nut is junk and we're free and clear there. Since we have the air hose out over here, we can grab our 3/8 impact and see if we can't get our axle unbolted from the transmission. This is a 13mm 12 point and a little sketchy because we're using a wobble. Get those off. So it's easier to get the bolts off when the axle is at the top position because the bolts are fighting the boots. I'm just realizing that I already took the rotor off and I have no way to turn the axle on this side. Might as well just put a lug bolt over here. We can work to get the upper control arm off. And now you should be able to gently walk the axle out of the hub or air hammer. That. There we go. There's the right axle. I'm going to shift over, get the left one taken care of. So yesterday I was able to get both axles out of the car, and well, today is going to be the messy part of the job where we need to disassemble these axles, clean all the grease out, and get the new boots on. However, there is one thing that's a little unique on these axles, and I'll show you with our replacement boot set. So we have here our inner boot that's already clamped on to our metal plate right here, which seals up the end of the joint, and then we have our outer plate which seals the back side of the joint. So you can see right here where we have the inner plate, and it seals onto this flange right here, the drive flange, and the back plate. So that's all pretty straightforward. I just take a screwdriver and you can gently tap these plates off, tap it off the other side. That'll give me access to the snap ring. I can slide the entire joint off and slide the entire boot off of the axle. So pretty standard and straightforward on the inner flange. On the outer flange, you can see that it has another tin cup essentially that encapsulates the joint inside of this outer stub. If you look at our boot kit, we're only equipped with just this boot. So we have our clamps and a new snap ring, but we do not have a replacement plate. Now I've found that it's not worth the effort to try to take this plate off because it is incredibly difficult to get this plate off and back on without damaging it, bending it, or leaving any tooling marks, and I don't want any evidence that I was ever really here. So I start on this end, I pop the plates off, get the joint disassembled, get that removed, get the boot off. I cut my clamps and I can slide the boot all the way off the end of the axle this way. It creates a little bit more work for myself at this point because I have to spend a little bit of extra time down here cleaning this extra grease out, and it's, you know, it's buried in there, you don't have great access, so it's a bit more work, but we'll get all that grease cleaned out while leaving this joint all assembled. And then we have our new grease. Same thing, it's quite a bit more work to get that grease worked back into the joints and distributed evenly in there without having this all the way out, but that's just what we're facing. Like I said, I could knock this off and be real rough and tough and you'd see that I was here, and for me, I'll spend the extra time to leave no traces that I was here, so that's my preferred method. Finesse and really just pride in what I'm doing. I really like to service these cars to the highest level that I can, even if that means more work for myself. So with that being said, this end's pretty straightforward. That end's just a little bit more labor intensive in work. I'm going to set you guys down. I'm going to work to get these disassembled, get them cleaned in the solvent tank. You can see that I have all the hardware here. That's all going to get a good bath and cleaning. We're going to put everything back on clean and dry. So I'm going to get these fully rebuilt, back together, back in the car, and well, move on to the other repairs. So let's get to work getting this stuff cleaned up and getting these new CV boots on our axles. So we got the axles rebuilt, and as you saw, we have everything back together and fully assembled. Now there is a couple things that I want to touch on before we move on and away from the axles. Now the first thing is the factory style clamps that were on the inner joints of the CV boots. They were a standard style ear clamp, and on the kit that I got for my new CV boots came with this style of fold over clamp. So they come essentially like this clamp right here, and you wrap them around and fold them over. I'll tell you the truth, guys, I really don't like this style clamp. It's very hard and difficult to get them tight enough, and for me, just having it folded over on itself is not very secure. So I did not use those clamps. I actually went back and sought out a new set of ear clamps, just like the factory, for the inner joints. The outers were fine. They were the right style, but I replaced those with the ear clamps, so that way I have, you know, the peace of mind that I know that that boot is clamped on, sealed tight, and I don't have to worry about a clamp coming off or any grease coming out. Now, speaking of grease, on the kit I got, it gave me those 4 bags of grease. Each one had 80 grams in it, and as it turns out, the factory workshop manual calls for 140 grams of grease per joint, so that means I was 60 grams shy on each joint, so I had to supplement all that grease with some other CV grease that I had. I suppose if you had a boot that wasn't torn and you cut it off and left some of the old grease in there, you could get away with just using those bags. But since we had everything fully apart and cleaned, I needed to supplement that to have adequate grease into the joint. One other thing to talk about here is on this inner flange. So it has these tin caps on either side, and I seal these caps up to this flange on the inside with some anaerobic sealant. I do so, I kind of go around the perimeter and on the inside where the bolt holes go all the way around. I do that because I have found over the course of time some of that grease can break down and get a little bit watery, and it can kind of have a tendency to leak out. Now there is one other thing to note here. From the factory there is the color is hard to describe. It's kind of a gray, green, or blue, and it's like this coating that they kind of paint on the center of this flange, and I suspect that it's some kind of coating they use to seal up these caps, so achieving the same thing that I use with the anaerobic sealant that's on there. Now, I recall years ago, somewhere in a factory workshop manual, I saw where it calls out what that product is to put it on there. I have never been able to find it since. The first time and only time I saw it, I thought, that's interesting, and moved on. I've gone back trying to find it, have never been able to source what that stuff is. If any of you guys know and know what that product is, let me know, because I would love to get my hands on it, to be able to put it back on there, give me a much, more factory look rather than having everything. I mean, yeah, it looks great that it's all clean, but I want it to look factory. So that's one thing that I haven't been able to find. I've gone back, I've dug through workshop manuals back to the 328s, all the way up 430s, 458, modern cars, old cars, everywhere. I cannot find any reference to what that coating is, so I'm hoping one of you guys out there just happens to know what it is or can point me in the direction to what it is, and hopefully I can find out what it is and chase them down. Now, moving on, obviously everything, as I mentioned, it's fully reassembled. I have everything torqued back to specs. I used blue Loctite on the bolts for the axles to the diff, and on our brake caliper bolts, these are torqued to 100 Newton meters, upper control arm 70. We're 275 Newton meters on this axle nut. And why we're talking about this axle nut, I'll show you guys right down here where it's staked. Now you can use a chisel and a hammer and do that. I use my air hammer to do so, but I take my chisel bit and you can see that I've really rounded it and smoothed this half of that bit. I do that specifically for this task, so that way I'm able to drive that in and punch it, but it's less likely to tear this. What I really want is it to deform and push into the groove and not tear it and cut it. And if I were to use this other side, which is a little sharper, it's definitely going to cut it and tear it. So this tool has been modified like this for years, but over time in use it starts to sharpen back up, so I have to come back and kind of just dull it down. And you only really need the half of the tool on there. You don't need to do the whole tool, so that gives me one side that I can use as a sharp chisel. So that's how I handle those stakes, got those taken care of. Now, while I was back here, I did examine the park brake shoes. They're not worn out, they have good wear, everything inside of there is good. I did take the time to readjust them, which is done through this top hole from the top, you can get to the adjuster. So I adjusted those on before I had everything bolted up so I could have a good feel, and got that readjusted. And obviously once the car goes back together on the other side, we'll be adjusting the park brake cable. So the whole system will be fresh and fully adjusted. And I think the last thing to talk about here is this is the missing hardware I referenced earlier. Now when I put the hardware on the front of the car, I only did these bolts back here because that's all I had. I was actually waiting on this special bolt with this rubber stub on them. They were on back order. They finally came in, so I got those tossed on, and I also naturally put them on the front as well. So with that, I mean, I think that is everything there is to talk about on the axles. You can see that they are cleaned up, but there's still a lot more cleanup to do to the engine. So with having all this wrapped up, we can move on to the next little project that we have, which is going to be our cracked exhaust flange on our catalytic converter. Alright, so I have the right-hand exhaust manifold and catalytic converter, and during our inspection we found that this flange is cracked, which is pretty common from these bolts being tightened too much. The way that these are built, it's not a great design, and with the heat cycles, if they don't crack right away on assembly, they can crack down the road. So fortunately, this slides onto the catalytic converter, and it does have an effect on our exhaust adjustment, so we will have to be careful when we're putting the car back together on where we have the new one placed. But really, we just need to get this old one off, and I'm hoping that this comes off without much fanfare. It's just 2 bolts and 2 nuts on either side. It's a little bit of like a clamp, so to speak. However, it's been on here for 25 years, so sometimes these guys can really be a bear to come off. So we'll work to get this hardware zipped out of here real quick, and hopefully we'll get this one off without much fuss, and I can show you the difference of this one versus the new one that we're going to replace it with. Now I was smart, did myself a favor, and I let these bolts soak in some penetrating lube for quite a while before I came over here to fuss with this. I wasn't interested in fighting the hardware to get out, and I'm really not interested in fighting the flange. Oh, there we go. So you can see that that whole piece is broken off. So it was only being retained on or clamped on by this side, but you can see even with the hardware out, it is pretty tight on there. We get this one's this one's not too bad. It's gonna slide right off for us. Wish they were all like this. There we go. Well, that wasn't too bad. So let's seize our opportunity here that we have that off and get this prepped for our new one. So let's try to move this so you guys can see. It's just a little rusty and corroded there, so I have some brown Scotch-Brite WD-40 and just clean up our joint a little bit, get any rust, corrosion, exhaust carbon buildup off of there, so that way our new flange will zip right on. Alright, that'll do it. I think I'll grab you guys and drop you in close and show you the difference of the old flange versus the new one. Before we start talking about these flanges, let's go to the hardware here for a second. Now, it's pretty common to find these bolts bent even without a cracked flange like we have, just from over tightening, and it'll kind of give it a little bit of a, it bends in the shaft of the bolt right here where you're trying to suck everything down real tight, and it's just because everything's on a radius. Those two halves are no longer parallel to each other the tighter you clamp them down, which was the case in what I had. I had a bend on both bolts, but the bolt on the side of the broken flange was pretty severe. And This hardware was still good enough for use, so went over to the bench vise, spent a little bit of time with a brass punch, and I got them straightened out the best that I could. Then went back over all the threads of the thread chasers, so we should be able to be good and reuse those. Now, as for our flanges, so we have our factory flange here. You know, I'm presuming this is a stainless steel item because of the lack of corrosion on it and rust. And really, they break right here. You can see there's a little bit of undercut, but just the junction from these ears where the bolts go through to the body of the flange is not strong enough to withstand the vibration, the heat cycles, and the tightening and loosening that they may see. Now, the hardware for this you do not need to touch to get the engine out. Remember, we have those bolt-on V-bands that go on there. And the only time this would be moved, or, you know, the hardware should be touched on this is if you're replacing a catalytic converter or if you're adjusting the exhaust, which, to be honest with you, with this repair, that's the biggest time sink that I'm going to have into it, is readjusting the exhaust now that I've taken this off, versus the act of getting this on and off the exhaust is pretty quick. But our replacement, we're going with the Hill Engineering piece. This is stainless steel, and this is billet versus cast. In addition to being billet, it's going to be a lot stronger, but you can see that we have a lot more meat right here where these clamp on and a lot nicer radius. So I have yet to see one of these fail. They're a lot nicer piece, and they're priced very fairly to where, for me, you know, on a 355, especially one with this much mileage, originality is not really a factor. Yes, we want to keep the car original, but it's not like I'm devaluing a very rare ultra original 355. And in that case, an aftermarket part like the Hill Engineering one, which is superior to the factory part, is an easy choice. So pretty simple. We're just going to get this slid back on. I'm going to loose mount the hardware, and as I mentioned, we're just going to leave it like that because when the engine's back in the car, we're going to have all of our time invested on fussing with the adjustment, because if you recall, this flange bolts on the bottom of the muffler, and the exhaust tips are attached to the muffler. And, well, I'm real picky in particular. Since we had everything out, we're touching it. I want to be sure that our exhaust tips are protruding from the bumper equally on each side, and also equal in each side cutout. So we're going to spend a little time, go through all the adjustments, make sure it's right. But, down and dirty, there's what you guys need to know on this rear exhaust flange. Well, we're getting a lot of checks off the checklist today. Really cruising along, getting a lot of these odds and ends taken care of. And the next thing that we need to focus our attention to is our wheel inserts. So if you recall, during my inspections, I found one cracked wheel insert. It is a pretty common thing on these 355s. They have a magnesium wheel, so they have these aluminum inserts that go in where the lug bolts seat into, and they usually get a small fracture right across there. Now, there's two companies that I'm aware of that make new inserts. One of them is Hill Engineering, which these ones are, and also Sticky RX makes inserts as well, although they are a little bit more economically priced than the Hill pieces. Unfortunately, they are not in stock right now, so we had to go with the Hill set. I have 20 of them, and we're going to address all of the wheels on the car. Fairly straightforward process, but there is a couple things to show you guys just to be aware of when you're doing it. So I've already driven one insert out of this wheel. You can see this guy right there, and it came out of this hole right here. You can have the remaining holes that you see there. Now, to get the inserts driven out, you just stand the wheel up. See if I can prop this here with my leg. I use this little washer just to disperse the load, and sets right in there like so. And I'll take my brass punch, and pretty simple from here, and just hammer that in and drive them out towards the front of the wheel. Now, once they are out of the wheel, get everything fixed here. There we go. So once they're out of the wheel, you can see that it's out right there. My light is not that great over here showing you guys, but there is like a silicone ring around in there that I presume is where it was sealing up with the factory pieces, and it breaks free from our existing one quite nicely, so we can leave that in there, drive the new ones in, and they'll still seat down all the way. However, you can look right here and see that this car has had its wheels repainted, so you can see there's some paint right there on those pieces. So once I drive these out, I actually am going back through, cleaning up all of that paint, making everything have a nice clean break right to where the magnesium for the wheel is. So I'll have a good clear separation, getting all that cleaned up, getting the bore cleaned up in preparation for my new inserts. Now to get these inserts reinstalled, I can think of a couple different ways we can get this taken care of. We could do the simplest and crudest method, which is to set them back in, use that punch or a hammer, and drive them back into the face of the wheel. Although I don't really like that because that's going to mar up the face of this insert, and I just think that's pretty subpar method of doing so. You know, you could use a press, but getting the wheel and tire up in a press is going to be pretty difficult, and these aren't that tight of a fit that really justifies a press, so that seems pretty, you know, difficult, making it harder on ourselves. We don't really need to go that route. What I have done in the past is I have tapped these in, got them started, and then actually held the wheel up to the car and used the lug bolts to suck the wheel to the car and drive these inserts in. That's worked well, but it's still a little bit cumbersome because you're trying to get the wheel onto the car, and really it's not a good process to be using the car as a tool, in my opinion. Methods have evolved, and now I just use a bolt with some washers. I put a bunch of painter's tape on this side that will face the outside of the insert. I'll set this in the hole, set the bolt through, and with the washers, this is going to act just like a little mini puller or press, I guess, where it's just going to pull that insert into the wheel, get it to sit flush, and I'll know that I have a good positive engagement on it, and I don't have to worry about trying to get the wheel up onto the car and using the lug bolts to do it. This is a cleaner method, simpler, and considering the fact that I have to do all 20, shouldn't be too bad, pretty straightforward. So I'm going to work on getting all these driven out, getting all that paint cleaned out, get everything cleaned up in the bore to make sure that there's nothing behind these inserts so they can sit flush into the wheels, and get all these new inserts driven in and replaced. I think from there, once I'm done with that, I'm probably going to just jump over, start cleaning up the transmission on the bottom side. It's been dripping long enough. We need to get back to sealing that up so I can work on getting that cleaned up in preparation for cover plate gaskets. So with that, I got a lot of work ahead of me. I'm going to set you guys down and just get to it, and see you guys here in a minute. All right, got our cover plates all ready to go back on. Give this one more wipe down, make sure that there's no more gear oil on it, which there was a little bit over there, that one side. It's already clean. We brake cleaned it. I got all the old gasket and the old sealant off of it, but I don't want any gear oil in there, and I don't want any gear oil specifically where the sealant is going to go. I mentioned it earlier, I like to use the gasket, and I use just a little bit of sealant on both sides. I'll show you guys, it's such a minuscule amount. That's the route I go here, so we don't want any gear oil on here because that's going to impede that sealant's ability to set up and bond to the aluminum. I think we're good there. Get this. So you can see on that cover plate, that there's really not much sealant. It's a super thin, very minor amount. And we'll just get that slid up and get some hardware going on it. Now I'm super picky on the hardware. You see me looking at the nuts, and since these have never been off, they've only been installed once. And when these nuts get tightened on the washers, it kind of leaves like a witness mark, I guess you could say, a little shiny ring on a side of that nut. And I'm always very aware, or try to be aware of that, so when I reinstall this nut the second time, I put that ring back up against the washer, and I think it just looks a lot better versus when they're flopped around. A keen eye can spot it when they're flopped around that the nut has been tightened down on both sides where it rubs up against the washer, and I don't really like that. So as you see me grabbing these nuts and just giving them that look over, that's what I'm looking for. So I'm sure they get them in the right orientation, just so it looks a little bit nicer. It's purely preference. So I did spend a little bit of time and tried to clean the bottom of the gearbox, but the bulk of that work is probably going to have to wait for once this drivetrain's back into the car and I have some better access. I can continue cleaning it and making it tidy and presentable how I'd like it. I'm also going to work all my bolts on, and then I'm going to have to circle back for the bolts that hold on the brackets for the wire for the speed sensor. I'm going to get them all on, get everything torqued and set in place, and then I'll just pop those nuts back off when the time comes to get those put on. Now I did realize I totally overlooked talking about a few key points when we're doing the CV boots. And one of those key things that I wanted to talk about is anytime you're breaking apart a suspension to do a repair or pull something off, just like I did with those CV boots, is you want to pay attention to what you're disconnecting, because depending on the car and the configuration, what you're disconnecting to break free to get, say, like a CV boot out is a great example. You could be loosening something that would be affecting the alignment to where you'd have to realign the car. So you want to be really aware of that and kind of have a good game plan, because you need to disassemble naturally the least amount of stuff that you have to, but you don't want to create more work for yourself where you'd lose an alignment. Now on a 355, our alignment is actually done up to where the lower control arms bolt up to the subframe, so we didn't have to worry about any of that. And it doesn't really apply for the CV boots on a 355 unless you took those bolts out, but there's shims in those locations, so that's not really a big deal as long as you got them back in the same place. A lot of cars with eccentric bolts, that's where that really comes into play. Now the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, if you notice, once I took the upper control arm off and the shock off, the whole hub and knuckle basically rotated all the way down to the ground. Now, if you have a car with a standard suspension bushing, that should not do that, because the bushing will keep enough tension on the arm and assembly where it wants to keep it up in the upper position, and it would actually be pretty hard to get everything lowered down. So if you have one that has a bushing like that, you don't want to just reef on the arm and push it down, because you're going to tear the bushing. Now, for the 355 and on most Ferraris, it's actually like a Heim joint, not a bushing. And that's what enabled the arm to fall all the way down and pretty much go to the ground. So that benefits me because I have more room to, get everything out of the way and get my parts out of the car. So what's important to note is during reassembly of any time you're doing suspension work, particularly with a suspension bushing, a solid rubber bushing, is you're going to want the suspension loaded with weight on it. And that's because as you tighten those bolts down, that bushing needs to be in a neutral state. If you have the suspension at a droop and you're torquing that bushing, you're going to put twist in it. Now, when I torqued everything on this 355, I did so with the engine here on the cradle and the suspension at its resting droop with all the suspension hooked up, but no load on it. Because I have those spherical bearings in there and not bushings, I don't have to worry about that. So it's actually a little bit easier because Ferrari does not use bushings. I mean, we do on the much older cars. Just something to keep in mind depending on the car you're working on, and also kind of knowing what type of bushings you have and what is needed to be done, because not all techniques or procedures can be applied across all ranges. You kind of have to adapt and modify depending on what you're working on. And I'm just coming back through and I'm getting all these torqued down. I'm torquing them to 60 inch-pounds. Yeah, 60 inch-pounds, which is, geez, Newton meter. What is that? 7 Newton meters. I like to use this little 1/4 inch torque wrench to get all this hardware torqued down, because you get a good consistent torque on all of them. And I've found that if you actually over tighten these, it can split that paper gasket and cause it to push out. So this is the best way that I can get these installed, ensuring that I'm not over torquing and I'm not damaging the gaskets that I just put in. So we're just, should have them all torqued, just doing one more around the world on them. Get those taken care of. Now, we'll take these nuts off so we can get our speed sensor wire harness brackets on. Kind of tricky with this being so low to the ground. I would definitely say less than ideal. There we go. Please stay. And we'll grab an adapter so we can get that speed sensor torqued. And that should do it. There we go. Sealed up. Still needs a little love with some cleaning, but we'll take care of that once this is back in the car. Well, had another small curveball thrown at us. Truth be told, it's been about a month since I've been out here doing the footage that you guys just watched on resealing and reinstalling those transmission cover plates. We've had the holiday seasons, Christmas and New Year's. I took quite a bit of time off actually from the shop to spend some time with the wife and kids, and I was doing some other miscellaneous work on the car. But during that process, I was going over some of the parts, and I found another small issue. After doing a little bit of consulting with the client back and forth, well, our scope of work grew just a little bit more. So I'll head you guys over the bench and show you what we need to take care of. Okay, so here's what I came across. This is our upper radiator hose, and when I pulled it off the car, everything looked great. Then when I was wiping it down and cleaning it, you can see right there that there's a stain on it that did not come off and is on there pretty good. Well, I got the looking a little bit closer on there from that stain, and I'll try to get you guys in there. But there's a small, you can see, I can get that lifted up. It's real small. Get in there. You can see there's a real small defect that I can lift right there with my screwdriver. So I have a small defect, or it looks like a rupture, and then obviously a trail where I would presume it's been leaking. Now, I have spent a fair amount of time trying to feel and check on the inside, and I don't feel anything on the inside of that, but clearly that gives us a lot of evidence that it is leaking. So I noted that down, and I didn't really like it. One thing to note, that this is a silicone hose, and I did relay that information to the customer. Now, the situation gets a little bit trickier because when we initially talked about what we were going to do to the car, the client did want to replace all of the cooling hoses on the car. It is a very common modification to make to these cars to replace all the coolant hoses with a silicone hose kit. The ones that I am used to using are the ones from Scuderia Rampante, and they're an excellent hose kit, really good quality. It comes with all the hoses and the clamps, and that is what I ended up quoting the customer to have me go through and replace all those hoses. He ended up declining that repair because, well, the price of that hose kit is actually pretty expensive. It's very, very high. And something I totally understood, and what we decided on was I would come back and inspect the hoses once everything's out, as we did, and make a judgment call from there. Well, from seeing this is the upper radiator hose. This hose is actually pretty easy to get on and off with the engine in the car. However, on the lower radiator hose, which is not easy to get on and off, this is a rubber hose, and if you note all the deformation it has on the hose around the hose clamps, you can see that the hose is swelling up down here on the bottom and up here on the top. Now that's not a huge deal. It's not overly concerning for me. It's not ideal. But considering that the lower hose, it slides so far onto the neck of the hard pipe and the water pump, the only way you'd be able to try to get that off with the engine in the car is pushing down off of the neck for the hard pipe on the hose and trying to go straight down. The problem with that is that hose pretty much sits directly on top of the water pump pulley, and you don't have any room to move the hose down. So getting that hose out with the engine in the car would be an absolute nightmare, and you're almost risking more damage to the new hose trying to get it squeezed together, manipulated and folded and back in. So it just really makes sense to do it now. So we're in a bit of a predicament because we already talked about the hoses. The upper hose is easy, and that's the one with the defect, but if we're going to replace the upper hose, we probably should replace the lower hose. So I actually did some looking around and got the customer some price quotes for some OEM, just replacement rubber hoses. However, he still expressed some desire for some silicone hoses, and ultimately I was able to find another kit of silicone hoses that gives me everything that I needed for the car, with exception to this. This is bulk hose that I had here in the shop that I'll be using, but it has the 2 radiator hoses, our 2 heater hoses, and all of our radiator, the hardline hoses. And this kit was a fraction of the price of the Scuderia Rampante kit. Now there is 2 big differences of these kits. The Scuderia Rampante kit comes with the hoses from the expansion tank to the hardlines, which I'll be needing this for, so it doesn't have that. And this kit does not come with any hose clamps. We will have to reuse our old hose clamps. And also, I'll show you right here, this is a Scuderia Rampante hose, and you can see that it is a silicone hose, but it does not have the appearance of a silicone hose. It's wrapped with a fabric type outer layer that's flat, and it's not that shiny silicone layer, as you can see right here. So the aesthetic difference of the 2 different style hoses is, I mean, it's a fair difference. It's still different than a rubber hose. These look pretty factory. But however, on the ply of them and the thickness, they are the same essentially. So the customer opted to go with this kit, which then actually enables me to go through and get all the hoses replaced like we originally discussed and planned. So to get these hoses on, our 2 radiator hoses, that's easy. Those are going to sit and wait for when the engine goes back in. Our 2 heater hoses, we can see that they're back over here on the firewall, dead center. Really nothing worth talking about. Those are easy to get in and out. However, all the hoses for the hard lines of the radiator, which are going to be these 4 hoses right here, there's 2 different ways we can go about replacing them. So let me get the car raised in the air and I'll walk you through either method. All right, so we're here in the engine bay, and I'm going to show you guys the 2 different methods that we could go about getting these hoses replaced. So these are the hard lines that I keep referencing, where the upper radiator hose attaches onto, and here is where our lower radiator hose attaches onto. Now these hard lines go to either side of the car, over to our left and right radiators. So those 4 smaller hoses, you can see right there, that's what they're for. It's for this connection to the radiator to this aluminum hard line. So there's 2 on each side. So we can go about this by either A, removing these hard lines from the car, leaving the radiators in, or we can leave the hard lines in and remove the radiators. So if we're looking over here to remove the hard lines, one thing to immediately keep in mind is we have this brace here for the structure of the car, and this line goes in quite a ways past it, so we're going to have to contend with that because it's on either side. On this side, it's pretty free and clear. There's not a lot to fight. You can see a pretty good clear shot of that innermost hose, and we can see the other hose over there. This is pretty movable. This is the air inlet that goes up onto the inlets on the body of the car. So that side, pretty straightforward. We're gonna have to take our struts back off, disconnect our vent line here for our fuel tank, move our throttle cable out of the way, get that out of the way. So we're going to take these two hoses off anyways because we're replacing those, so it gets all pretty easy until you get over here. So we have part of our fuel tank vent, so we're going to have to remove that. We've got a couple lines. You can see that it all goes back up to the charcoal canister. Power steering hose, again, our other strut. Not too bad. Our fuel lines, fuel filter's probably going to have to come out, but I need to replace this anyways as part of the service, so that's not a huge deal. Now, if we were to take out the radiators. For one, the radiators, if I can show you guys, just has one central bolt right up there where they're held in. So it's one bolt and pull it out. This side would be pretty easy. You just have your electrical connector up here, another one down here for your fan. However, our fuel filler pipe, you can see it's running right down at a diagonal and it's significantly in the way. Now these fuel filler pipes are plastic, and on some of the cars they can get brittle and break, and it's kind of a big issue. So it is my preference not to be messing with this if I don't have to, just because it's an old plastic piece. This one feels pretty good. As you can see, it still is quite flexible, but if I can do something and not have to disrupt that, that's a perk. The other thing is we have our condenser on the front side of this radiator, so you can see my AC lines coming down right here, and I have that junction right here. So I'd either have to disconnect this junction, this hose is off because it's off of the AC compressor, or disconnect both of those up there, and then I'd be able to pull that radiator out. So it's possible, but a fair bit more work. On this side, to get the radiator out, it's just a little bit of wiring, one bolt, and it'll pop right off. The oil cooler, I probably have to separate the oil cooler from the radiator, pull it off first, and then pull the radiator out. So it's a real fine line on which method is easier and better. In my opinion, when the engine is out, I prefer to take the hard lines off. I just find it to be less work, I have more working space, and I like to avoid the fuel filler neck. Now, if I had to do these with the engine in the car, I would probably go the route of removing the radiators, because with the engine in the car, you're not removing those hard lines. That's pretty much your only choice. So we have the option now to do it because the engine's out. That's the method I'm going to take. I'm pulling the hard lines out. We're going to leave the radiators in. So with that being said, I'm going to set you guys down. We're going to get cranking and get these replaced, get all this done. I'll probably jump over and take care of that new fuel filter while I'm doing this as well. And I'll bring you guys back and let you know, any tips or tricks or hints, or just give you any insights I had from doing the repair. And yeah, let's get to it. All right, so we got all the hoses out and replaced with really not much fanfare at all. It all went as I expected. Also, you saw I got the fuel filter replaced, and I do like to write the mileage and the date of service on the fuel filter. It just makes a great reference when they get replaced again. The one that I pulled out did have that written on there, and well, the car has 10,000 miles on that fuel filter, so I'm not sure if that's when the client had his last belt service done, but that was when the last time the filter was replaced, which traditionally the fuel filter is replaced during the major service or the belt service. As for the hoses, they look pretty good. These radiator hoses really don't show any signs of wear. I removed them without cutting them, which is always my preference. And I did not expect to find anything there, but it's good preventative maintenance, taking care of all these hoses. Really, with our heater hoses as well, they all pretty good shape. We really just have the questionable upper radiator hose and the, again, questionable lower radiator hose, which really drove us into this repair. But as I mentioned, everything was pretty much as expected. But while I was doing the work, I realized that there's a couple things that are worth mentioning to you guys that kind of elaborate on or explain in a little bit more detail. One of those is, I could probably hear some of you at home thinking you can just cut these old hoses off and slide the new ones on, leave those hard lines in the car, and leave the radiators in. I can tell you that's not going to happen. The distance or space you have in between where the hard line ends to the neck of the radiator is maybe just a hair over a quarter inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch. It is very, very tight window. So you could cut those old hoses off and get them off, but there's not enough room to slide in your new hoses. It's just not going to happen. You probably saw in the video that I use glass cleaner to spray onto the hoses because I have to slide them all the way onto the hard pipes so there's no overhang, position the hard pipes into the car, and then I slide the hoses onto the neck of the radiator. So that's really why you have to remove those to get it done. But it's also another tip that I want to talk about, which is that glass cleaner. I stay away from anything that's a grease, a silicone, or any lubricant on those hoses. Even a soap. I stay away from all of those items. Yep, they're going to help that slide on and make it a lot easier for assembly. But the thing that I don't like about any of those solutions is it never fully dries, it never fully goes away, and it's always going to leave a slip lubricating type surface there. And that's just asking for a hose to come off and a poor seal. Glass cleaner is mostly alcohol, so I can spray that in there. It lubricates everything real good. You just saw that I slid everything right on, and then it all dries up and evaporates. Gives me a much better and more secure connection for the hose to the hard pipe and the radiator, and I don't have to worry about them coming off. Sure, these ones are in there so tight, not much of a chance, but on other hoses and other places, it makes a bigger difference. It's just a habit I've always gone to, so that's what I did on this application. The other thing I want to talk about is the hose clamps. I mentioned on the other kit that I'm used to using, which is a Scuderia Rampante kit, they have new hose clamps and they're a different style and quite robust, and you really do have to tighten these down quite a bit. I've also found that the factory hose clamps are still quite good. You saw me get them cleaned up, but one of the things I like to do is I put some lubricant on the worm gear drive of the clamp, so I just sprayed some WD-40 in there. I did so because once I put the clamps on and I'm tightening them down, just that little bit of lubrication really helps that worm gear go on the clamp, helps the clamp tighten, and helps them prevent from stripping out. With all of these silicone hoses, you really have to reef them down and get them very tight. You saw that I was using a flexible driver to tighten down all the clamps, and it basically I'm giving that all the force I have before that shaft of that flexible driver gives out. Really, really, really tight, especially with the silicone hoses. Now, there's another thing to consider, and that's the orientation of the hose clamps. Once I get this car running and I get some heat and temperature in the engine, I need to come back through and retighten all of these hose clamps. So we're going to give it a couple heat cycles, let everything get hot, let those hose clamps get hot and softer, come back and retighten them. So I had to orient all those hose clamps in a position to where once the car is fully assembled, I can come back in there, get to them, and tighten them all down. And that's just another thing we're going to do to help minimize coolant leaks. If you recall, on the very first video of this car, I did the inspection with a coolant pressure test. It had a coolant leak. I mentioned in that video that loose hose clamps are a chronic problem on all Ferraris, where they loosen up and the car will drip coolant. Once it warms up, it goes away. This is really the same thing. So the car heat cycles, I'm going to tighten all those hose clamps. I'm going to let it cool down at the very end, and I'm going to tighten them again. I'll probably come back through a couple times and just really make sure that they're tight so they're not leaking now, and they won't be leaking down the road for the client. All right, guys, this is not the style of video I normally like doing. I normally like to make a coherent video that stays focused on one subject from start to finish. I don't like to kind of jump around from task to task to task. However, all the things that we did today were pretty short, not a lot to cover on them, and there's really no way I could have made an individual video for each item. I was kind of torn because I figured this video was going to be tricky to make, but I also wanted to show everything we're doing to the car, but I didn't want to make a video where we're jumping around everywhere. So in the end, I ended up just deciding to come out here and film it anyways, and we'll put it together and edit it. And I guess if you guys are watching this video, it made the cut, and I decided to post it. So, still waiting on the cylinder heads. That's really the big holdup on this project. However, I'm not at a dead stop. I still have a lot of cleanup and prep to do, specifically on the engine, all the parts I pulled off. I got to scrape a lot of gaskets. I got to prep all the surfaces for the new gaskets, replace a bunch of O-rings and seals. So there's a bit of work that's going to keep me busy. I also need to build my own mercury columns or manometers, so that way once this car is all back together and the engine's in and running, we're going to be able to properly balance and synchronize the throttles. So my hope is that I can get all those tasks knocked out, and once I'm done with them, or even before that, the heads show up, so that way there's no downtime on that and we can keep trucking on this project. Alright, you guys know the drill. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment below, share it with your buddy, and more importantly, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do. I'd really appreciate it. Stick around and enjoy more of this 355 with me. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.